The wind came down from the high peaks of the Bitterroot Range like a judgment, sharp and unforgiving, carrying with it the scent of pine resin and coming snow. It was late afternoon in the winter of the late 1870s, and the light was already failing, draining out of the valley bottom and leaving the frozen creek bed a ribbon of bruised gray ice. The mountains to the west, jagged and massive, were turning a deep, melancholy purple against a sky that looked like hammered iron. There was no warmth left in the world, only the biting cold that settled in the lungs and made every breath feel like swallowing glass. The snow on the ground was thin, a crusty, wind-scoured layer that barely covered the frozen mud and dormant bunch grass. But the air held the heavy silence that promised a blizzard was gathering its strength somewhere just out of sight. Lena Carter walked along the game trail that served as the only road through this part of the woods, her boots crunching rhythmically on the hard-packed earth. She was 22 years old, though the harshness of the territory and the shadows under her eyes made her look older. She carried a burlap sack over one shoulder, the rough fabric chafing her wool coat. Inside were the meager supplies she had bartered for at the trading post 5 miles back: a sack of flour, some dried beans, a tin of coffee, and a few strips of cured pork. It was enough to keep her alive for another 2 weeks in the small, drafty cabin she now called home, but the weight of it dragged at her shoulders. She did not walk with the casual, open gait of someone who felt safe. Her steps were quick and clipped. Every few minutes, she paused, twisting her neck to look behind her, her eyes scanning the dark tree line where the lodgepole pines grew thick and straight as prison bars. She was tense, a wire pulled tight and ready to snap. It was not just the cougars or the wolves she feared, though both hunted in these woods. It was the people. Lena knew what they said about her in town. She had seen the way the shopkeeper's wife pulled her skirts aside when Lena entered the store, as if sin were a fever that could jump from one person to another. She had heard the whispers that followed her like a cloud of gnats. To them, she was not Lena, the daughter of the kindly schoolteacher who had died of consumption 3 winters ago. She was the fallen woman, the taint, the one who had led a good man astray. The rumors were a tangled knot of lies and half-truths that no one cared to unravel. They said she had seduced a married rancher, a wealthy man with a fragile wife. They said her wickedness had driven the wife to hang herself in the barn. They never spoke the truth, which was far uglier and far more complicated. They never spoke of the nights the rancher had cornered her, the power he held over her father's debts, or the way he had twisted the narrative to save his own reputation when the guilt became too much. The town preferred a simple villain, and a young woman with no family to defend her was the easiest target they could find. She adjusted her grip on the sack, her fingers numb inside her knitted gloves. She just needed to get home. If she could get inside, bar the door, and light a fire, she could shut out the world for another night. High up on the ridge to her left, 2 shadows detached themselves from the darkness of the trees. Harlan Pike shifted his weight, the snow crunching softly under his boots. He was a big man, heavy in the gut but solid, with a face that looked like it had been carved out of sandstone and left in the rain. His coat was buffalo hide, patchy and smelling of wet dog and stale tobacco. Beside him stood Duke Morris, younger, wirier, with eyes that moved too fast and a nervous habit of chewing on his mustache. "There she is," Duke whispered, his breath pluming in the frigid air. The scent of cheap whiskey hung around them, a pungent fog that cut through the clean smell of the pine. Harlan spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the pristine snow, a dark, ugly stain. "You sure it is her?" "I am sure," Duke hissed. "I saw her at the post. That is the Carter girl." Harlan watched her walk. His eyes narrowed. She looked small. Hard to believe someone that small could cause so much trouble. It is what she knows. "Harlan, you know what she saw. If she opens her mouth to the wrong lawman, or if that circuit judge actually listens to a woman like her, we are finished. We have to shut her up before she talks." Lena stopped again. The woods felt suddenly wrong. The birds, few as they were in this season, had gone silent. The wind rattled the dry needles of the pines, a sound like 1,000 hushed voices. She gripped the neck of the sack tighter. She had learned to trust her instincts. They were the only things that had kept her alive this long. She took a step, then another, picking up her pace. "Well, look what we have here," a voice rasped, heavy and mocking. Lena spun around, nearly losing her footing on a patch of ice. Harlan and Duke stepped out from behind the trunk of a massive ponderosa pine, blocking the trail ahead of her. They were 10 yards away, but they felt suffocatingly close. Both men had their revolvers drawn, the metal dark and dull in the fading light. Lena's heart slammed against her ribs. She recognized them, not by name, perhaps, but by the look of them. The same look she had seen on the faces of the men who lounged outside the saloon, eyes tracking her with a mix of lust and contempt. But there was something more specific in her memory, a flash of a wet, muddy alley behind the livery stable 2 weeks ago. The crack of a gunshot, a deputy falling face first into the mud. These were the men. "You look like you're in a hurry." "Missy," Harlan said, taking a slow, heavy step toward her. The gun in his hand was steady. "I have no business with you," Lena said, her voice shaking despite her best effort to steal it. She took a step back, her boots slipping on the frozen gravel. "Just let me pass." "Oh, but we have business with you," Duke said, grinning, a nervous, twitchy grin that showed bad teeth. "You have got a good memory, do not you? You remember faces." Lena's stomach turned over. They knew she had been in the alley that night, huddled behind a stack of crates, freezing and terrified, while they murdered the deputy and planted the gun on a drunken drifter. "I did not say anything," Lena stammered, the cold air burning her throat. "I never told anyone." "And we aim to keep it that way," Harlan said. "See, the problem with women is they get emotional. They get a conscience. Maybe you decide later to tell the sheriff the drifter did not do it. Maybe you decide to clear your conscience. We cannot have that." He raised the pistol slightly, aiming it at her chest. Panic, cold and sharp as a knife, severed her thoughts. This was not a robbery. This was an execution. Lena dropped the sack of supplies. The flour burst inside, puffing a small white cloud into the air. She did not scream. Her throat was too tight for sound. She simply turned and bolted. She threw herself off the trail and into the dense tangle of the woods, blindly crashing through the underbrush. "Hey!" Duke shouted. A gunshot cracked through the air, deafeningly loud in the quiet valley. A spray of bark exploded from a tree trunk inches from Lena's head, stinging her cheek. She gasped, stumbling, her hands scrabbling for purchase on the rough bark as she pushed herself forward. She ran without direction, driven only by the primal need to put distance between herself and the men behind her. Low-hanging branches whipped her face, leaving stinging welts across her skin. Her long skirts tangled in the briars, tearing with sharp, ripping sounds that seemed incredibly loud to her ears. She slipped on a patch of ice hidden beneath the snow, her knees slamming into the frozen ground, jarring her teeth. Pain shot up her legs, but the terror was stronger. Old memories swirled in her mind, overlapping with the present danger, the smell of the rancher's brandy, the weight of a heavy hand on her shoulder, the feeling of being trapped in a corner with no way out. It made it hard to breathe, hard to think. She scrambled up, her breath coming in ragged, sobbing gasps, and forced her legs to move. "Get back here!" Harlan's voice roared from behind her, closer than she expected. He was heavy, but he could move when he wanted to. Lena pushed through a thicket of young fir trees, the needles scratching her neck. She could hear them crashing through the brush behind her, cursing the snow and the thorns. They were hunting her like an animal. As she burst through the thicket and into a wider, sparser section of the forest, a new sound cut through the blood rushing in her ears. It was a rhythmic, thudding vibration in the ground. Hoofbeats, heavy and fast. Someone was riding hard nearby. Lena's lungs were burning. She saw a clearing ahead, a break in the trees where the light was a little brighter. If she could reach it, maybe someone would see her, maybe the rider. She pushed herself to a sprint, her legs heavy as lead. Another shot rang out, wild this time, singing through the branches high above her head. Beyond the ridge, in a shallow draw that ran parallel to the trail, Caleb Morgan reined in his horse. He was a man of 32 years, though the scar that ran along his jawline and the grim set of his mouth made him look seasoned beyond his age. He wore a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over his eyes and a canvas coat that had seen more rain and dust than most men saw in a lifetime. Behind his saddle horse, a sturdy bay gelding. He led a string of 3 pack horses, all loaded with gear. He was heading for the Double R outfit, a cattle operation 3 days' ride north. Looking for work for the spring season, he kept to himself. He spoke little. He was trying, with a desperate, quiet determination, to leave the border country behind him, down near the Mexican line. He had worked for a man named Josiah King, a rancher who ruled his land with a riding crop and a hangman's rope. Caleb had done things there he could not wash off, no matter how much icy creek water he used. He had promised himself, when he finally rode away 2 months ago, that he was done with violence. He would mind his own business. He would survive, and that would be enough. Then he heard the scream. It was faint, carried on the wind, but it was unmistakably a woman's cry of pure terror. Caleb froze. His hand went instinctively to the Navy Colt resting in the holster at his hip. "Do not do it," he told himself. "Keep riding. It is not your fight." Then the gunshot echoed, a flat, ugly crack that rolled off the hills. The horse beneath him danced nervously, sensing the tension in his rider. Caleb sat motionless for a heartbeat, his gray eyes staring into the dark woods. He thought of the times he had looked away before. He thought of the silence that followed the violence he had witnessed, and how that silence was heavier than the noise. Another shot. Caleb swore under his breath, a short, sharp curse. He could not do it. He could not ride away. He spurred the bay hard, wheeling the animal around and driving it up the steep embankment out of the draw. The pack horses pulled at their lead ropes, protesting, but he ignored them, dropping the lead line to let them scatter if they had to. He needed speed. He crashed through the brush, the horse's chest breaking through the dry undergrowth. Branches whipped at his coat. Snow sprayed up under the iron-shod hooves. He guided the horse by instinct and sound, leaning forward in the saddle, his eyes scanning the flickering gaps between the trees. He burst into the edge of a small clearing just as a figure stumbled out of the woods opposite him. It was a woman. Her hair had come loose from its pins, a dark tangle around her pale face. Her dress was torn at the hem, and mud smeared her cheek. She looked wild, her eyes wide with a terror so absolute it made Caleb's stomach clench. She took 2 steps into the open, her foot caught on a buried root, and she went down hard, sprawling in the snow and mud. She did not get up. She scrambled backward on her elbows, staring at the tree line she had just emerged from. 2 men burst out of the shadows after her. One was big, in a buffalo coat. The other was thin and wiry. Both had guns in their hands. The big one raised his pistol, aiming at the woman on the ground. "Hey!" Caleb shouted, his voice booming in the small space. He kicked his horse forward, closing the distance in 3 long strides. He drove the bay right between the woman and the 2 men, hauling back on the reins so the horse reared slightly, its hooves churning the snow. He swung the animal sideways, creating a living wall of muscle and bone to shield her. His hand was already on his gun, thumb resting on the hammer, but he did not draw yet. He held his position, sitting tall in the saddle, his gaze locked on the 2 men. Harlan Pike skidded to a halt, startled by the sudden appearance of the rider. Duke nearly ran into him. They lowered their guns slightly, but did not holster them. "Who the hell are you?" Harlan snarled, his chest heaving from the run. "That does not matter," Caleb said. His voice was calm, almost flat, but it carried a steel edge that cut through the panting breaths of the other men. "You boys look like you're about to do something you cannot take back. This is none of your concern." "Cowboy," Harlan spat, stepping to the side to try and get a clear line of sight to Lena. "Ride on. You do not see anything here. You just keep moving. And you live to see supper." Caleb shifted the horse, blocking Harlan's view again. He glanced down quickly. Lena was curled on the frozen ground, her chest heaving. He saw the bruise forming on her wrist and the raw scrape on her cheek. He saw the way she looked at him, not with hope, but with the expectation of death. "It became his concern when you started shooting at a woman," Caleb said. "She is a witness to things that do not concern you," Duke yelled, his voice cracking. "She has got a loose tongue. We are just fixing a problem." Caleb looked back at Harlan. The big outlaw's eyes were cold. Dead things. There was no reasoning there. These men had already decided to kill her. Now they were just calculating if they had to kill him too. "Back off," Caleb said, his hand tightening on his grip. "Put the guns away and walk back the way you came. You are making a mistake," Harlan said softly. "A grave mistake. No one will ever know. Boy, just us in the trees." Caleb saw Harlan's knuckles whiten. He saw the subtle shift in Duke's shoulder. "Drop them," Caleb ordered. Harlan moved fast for a big man. He brought his pistol up, firing before he had fully leveled it. The bullet whizzed past Caleb's ear, sounding like an angry hornet. Caleb drew and fired in one fluid motion, a skill honed in the dusty border towns he tried to forget. His shot went wide as his horse shied from the noise, but it forced Harlan to duck behind a thick pine trunk. The clearing exploded into chaos. The sharp crack, crack, crack of gunfire shattered the winter silence. "Get down!" Caleb shouted at Lena. Lena scrambled on her hands and knees, throwing herself behind a fallen, rotting log just as a bullet kicked up a spray of snow where she had been lying. She pressed her face into the damp wood, covering her head with her arms, the noise deafening her. Duke, panicked and aggressive, stepped out into the open, firing wildly at the mounted man. Caleb's horse danced and spun, making him a harder target. Caleb steadied his aim, exhaled, and squeezed the trigger. The heavy coat bucked in his hand. Duke spun around as if slapped by an invisible giant. He cried out, clutching his left shoulder, his gun dropping into the snow. "I am hit! Harlan, I am hit!" Harlan popped out from behind the tree, firing 2 more shots that whistled perilously close to Caleb's thigh. Caleb returned fire, splintering the wood next to Harlan's face. "We are leaving!" Harlan roared. Grabbing the staggering Duke by the collar of his coat, he dragged the younger man backward into the dense cover of the trees. "You hear me, Cowboy? This is not over. We will track you. You are dead men walking." Caleb kept his gun trained on the shadows, his heart hammering against his ribs. He waited, listening to the sounds of their retreat, crashing brush, pained curses, and the crunch of snow fading into the distance. Silence rushed back into the clearing, heavier than before. The smell of black powder smoke hung acrid and sharp in the cold air, stinging the nose. Caleb sat motionless for another moment, ensuring they were truly gone. Then he holstered his gun and swung down from the saddle. His boots hit the ground with a solid thud. He calmed his horse with a hand on its neck, murmuring a quiet word, before turning toward the log. "You can come out now," he said. His voice was rough, the adrenaline still coursing through him. Lena slowly lifted her head. She was trembling so violently her teeth chattered. She looked at him with wide, skittish eyes, like a deer that had run until it could run no more. She did not stand up. She stayed crouched in the snow, her hands gripping her torn skirt. Caleb approached her slowly, his hands visible and empty. He saw the way she flinched when he stepped closer. He stopped 5 feet away. "Are you hit?" he asked. Lena shook her head. A jerky, mechanical motion. No, I do not think so." Caleb unbuttoned his canvas coat. Beneath it, he wore a thick wool vest and a flannel shirt. He shrugged out of the heavy coat, the cold air immediately biting through his remaining layers, and held it out to her. "Put this on," he said. "You are freezing." Lena stared at the coat, then at him. She was used to men who offered things. There was always a price. A drink meant a touch, a ride meant a favor, a rescue meant ownership. "Why?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Why did you stop?" Caleb looked at her, really looked at her. He saw the fear that went deeper than just the gunfight. He recognized the look of someone who had been cornered 1,000 times before. "Because 2 men were shooting at you," he said simply. "That is reason enough." He took a step closer and draped the coat over her shoulders. She stiffened but did not pull away. The coat was heavy and smelled of horse, tobacco, and wood smoke. It was warm from his body. She pulled it tight around herself, her fingers clutching the lapels. "We cannot stay here," Caleb said, glancing back toward the woods where the outlaws had vanished. "They are hurt and they are angry. They will circle back once they patch up that shoulder. We need to move." Lena looked at his horse, then back at the dark forest. I have a cabin. It is not far." "No," Caleb said firmly. "If they know who you are, they know where you live. That is the first place they will look." "Then where?" Lena asked, panic rising in her voice again. "I know a place. An old trapper's shack up near the creek headwaters. It is hidden. We can hole up there until the storm passes or until we figure out what to do." He reached out a hand to help her up. Lena looked at the hand. It was large, the skin roughened by rope and weather, the knuckles scarred. It was a hand that could hurt, but it was also the hand that had just held a gun between her and death. She hesitated. Trusting him felt like stepping off a cliff in the dark, but staying here meant dying. She reached out and placed her small, cold hand in his. Caleb's grip was firm and steady. He pulled her up from the snow with an easy strength that surprised her. He did not pull her close or linger. He simply supported her weight until she found her footing. "I am Caleb," he said. Lena looked up at him, seeing the scar on his jaw and the shadow of his hat brim over his eyes. "Lena," she said. "Come on, Lena," Caleb said, turning toward his horse. "Let us get you out of here." He made a stirrup with his hands and helped her mount the tall bay horse. As she settled into the saddle, feeling the heat of the animal beneath her, she watched Caleb gather the reins. He mounted behind her, sitting on the edge of the saddle cantle, keeping a respectful distance between his body and hers, his arms reaching around her only to hold the reins, despite the cold, despite the throbbing ache in her legs and the terror still swirling in her gut. Lena felt a strange sensation as the horse began to move. It was the feeling of being guarded. For the first time in years, there was a barrier between her and the world. It was fragile, and it was terrifying. But as they rode into the deepening twilight, the warmth of the stranger's coat was the only thing that felt real. The forest grew dense and ancient as they climbed away from the valley floor. The lodgepole pines, straight and narrow as prison bars, gave way to towering spruces with boughs heavy enough to block out the remaining light of the day. The air up here was thinner, sharper, tasting of iron and coming snow. Caleb guided the bay horse with a subtle pressure of his knees, keeping one hand on the reins and the other resting near the swell of the saddle, ensuring Lena remained steady behind him. They moved in silence, the only sounds the crunch of hooves breaking through the crust of the snow and the wind sighing through the upper canopy. It was a lonely, mournful sound, like the earth itself was grieving. He led them off the main game trail, weaving through thickets of alder and climbing steep ridges where the rock jutted out like broken bone. He knew this country the way a man knows the scars on his own hands. Years ago, during a hard winter when he was barely 20, he had trapped beaver along these creeks. He remembered a shelter, a place built by a man who had died or moved on long before Caleb had ever cinched a saddle. "We are almost there," Caleb said over his shoulder. His voice was low, barely rising above the wind. Lena did not answer. She was shivering against his back, her arms wrapped tight around his waist, not out of affection, but out of necessity. The heat from his body was the only thing keeping the numbness at bay, but even that was fading as the temperature plummeted with the setting sun. The sky above the trees had turned a flat, heavy gray, the color of a gun barrel, pressing down on the treetops. They crested a final ridge and looked down into a narrow, bowl-shaped hollow, a creek choked with jagged sheets of ice and black water. Cut through the center, on the far bank, tucked into a grove of aspen and fir, stood the cabin. It was a rough, ugly thing. The logs were dark with age and rot, chinked with dried mud that had crumbled away in places. The roof was a patchwork of hand-split shingles and thick moss, sagging dangerously in the middle. Snow was piled high against the north wall, drifting up to the eaves. The stone chimney leaned drunkenly to the side, black with the soot of 1,000 fires. It looked abandoned, desolate, and utterly welcoming. Caleb rode the horse down the slope, the animal sliding on its haunches in the loose shale. When they reached the bottom, the wind died down, blocked by the ridge. But the cold settled in deeper, a still and heavy frost that burned exposed skin. He pulled the horse up a few yards from the door. The cabin seemed to stare back at them with its single, dark window. "Stay on the horse," Caleb ordered softly. He dismounted, his boots sinking into the snow. He drew his revolver, the metal cold against his palm, and approached the door. It hung slightly ajar, scraping against the frozen mud of the threshold. He pushed it open with the toe of his boot, leveling the gun at the shadows inside. Nothing moved. A squirrel chattered angrily from a nearby branch, the sound startlingly loud, but the cabin held its silence. Caleb stepped inside, his eyes adjusting to the gloom. It smelled of damp earth, pine needles, and the distinct, musky scent of old wood rats. It was empty. He holstered his gun and turned back to the door. "It is clear," he called out. He walked back to the horse and reached up for Lena. She was stiff with cold, her movements slow and clumsy. As she slid down into his arms, her legs buckled, numb from the ride. He caught her, holding her upright for a moment until she found her footing. She felt small inside the heavy canvas of his coat, fragile as a bird. "Get inside," he said. "I will see to the horse." Lena nodded, pulling the coat tighter around her throat, and stumbled toward the dark doorway. Inside, the cabin was little more than a wooden box. The wind whistled through the gaps in the logs, bringing tiny drifts of snow with it. The single window was broken, patched clumsily with a piece of oil-stained canvas that flapped rhythmically in the draft. In the corner stood a cast-iron stove, rusted to a dull orange, its stovepipe wired together with baling wire. Against the far wall was a narrow bunk built of rough planks, filled with dried pine boughs that had long since turned brown and brittle. Lena stood in the center of the room, shivering violently. She felt exposed. Despite the walls, she was alone in the wilderness with a man she did not know, a man who had killed to get her here. The reality of her situation began to sink in through the haze of shock. She looked down at herself. Her dress was torn at the hem, wet with snow and mud. Her boots were scuffed. Her hands were raw and scraped, trembling uncontrollably. She knew what she looked like. She looked like exactly what the town said she was. A woman of loose morals, a woman who ran into the woods with men. If the shopkeeper's wife or the church deacon could see her now, standing in this filth with a cowboy's coat over her shoulders, they would nod their heads in grim satisfaction. They would say this was inevitable. The shame was a hot, bitter taste in her mouth. She hated them. She hated the town that had judged her for crimes she had not committed. And she hated that their judgment still held power over her, even here in the middle of nowhere. The door creaked open, and Caleb entered, carrying his saddlebags and a blackened coffee pot. He kicked the door shut behind him and dropped a heavy wooden bar into place. He did not look at her. He went straight to the stove, kneeling before it. "Wood is dry in the box," he muttered. Lucky for us, he worked with practiced efficiency, shaving slivers of pitch pine with a knife and stacking them inside the rusted belly of the stove. He struck a lucifer match on the sole of his boot, the flare of sulfur briefly illuminating his sharp features, the scar on his jaw, the serious set of his mouth. Within minutes, a fire was roaring, the stove ticking and groaning as the metal expanded. The light flickered through the grate, casting long, dancing shadows against the walls. Caleb stood up and turned to her. In the firelight, he saw the mud on her face, the wild tangle of her hair, the way she hugged herself as if trying to hold her shattered pieces together. He looked away, giving her the only privacy he could offer. "There is water in the canteen," he said, gesturing to the saddlebags he had dropped on the floor. "And there is a blanket rolled up in there, too. It is wool. It will warm you faster than that canvas coat." He turned his back to her, occupying himself with checking the prime on his pistol, spinning the cylinder slowly. Lena watched his back. It was broad, the muscles tense beneath his flannel shirt. She did not move toward the saddlebags immediately. Suspicion, sharp and familiar, coiled in her gut. She had known men who offered help. The rancher had offered help. At first, he had offered to pay her father's debts. He had offered kindness, right up until the moment he decided he was owed something in return. "Why?" she asked. Her voice was brittle, cracking in the dry air. Caleb paused, his hand still on his gun. "Why what? Why are you doing this?" she asked. She took a step back, putting the stove between them. "You could have ridden on. You could have left me to them. You do not know me. You do not know what I am." Caleb slowly holstered the pistol and turned to face her. His expression was unreadable, his gray eyes steady in the flickering light. "I know 2 men were trying to put a bullet in you," he said. "That is all I need to know." "That is not enough," Lena snapped, her fear turning into aggression. "Men do not risk their lives for nothing. Not for a stranger." "What do you want? Is it money? I have none. Is it something else?" She pulled the coat tighter, her knuckles white. Caleb's face hardened, but not with anger at her. He looked tired. He took off his hat and set it on the rough table by the door, running a hand through his dark, matted hair. "I do not want your money, Lena, and I do not want anything else from you." "Then why?" she demanded. "Why fight them? Why bring me here?" Caleb looked at the fire, watching the flames lick at the grate. He was silent for a long time, searching for words he rarely spoke. "I have seen enough wrong in this world," he said quietly. "I have seen men hurt people just because they could. I have seen folks look the other way because it was easy. I decided a long time ago I was done looking the other way." He looked back at her, his gaze direct and piercing. "I am not like them," he said. "I promise you that. I am just a man trying to get to the spring grass without any more blood on my hands. But I will not ride away from a woman being hunted like a wolf." Lena stared at him, searching his face for the lie. She looked for the leer, the smirk, the hidden calculation. She found only exhaustion and a strange, solemn sadness. Slowly, the tension in her shoulders eased. She let out a breath she did not know she had been holding. She walked to the saddlebags and pulled out the wool blanket. It was scratchy and smelled of horse. But when she wrapped it around herself, discarding the canvas coat, the warmth was immediate and merciful. She sat down on a small wooden crate near the stove, extending her hands toward the heat. Caleb pulled up another crate, sitting on the opposite side of the stove, keeping a respectful distance. He took out a small sack of coffee beans and began to grind them with the butt of his knife handle against the table. "Who were they?" he asked after a while. "The men in the woods." Lena stared into the fire. The image of the deputy falling into the mud flashed before her eyes. "Harlan Pike and Duke Morris." She whispered, "They are outlaws. They ride with a gang down near the territory line. But they come north when the law gets too close down there. And why do they want you dead?" Lena swallowed hard. The truth was a dangerous thing to carry. It had already cost one man his life. "2 weeks ago," she began, her voice trembling. "I was in town late. I was avoiding the main street. I went behind the livery stable to take the shortcut home. I heard voices, arguing." She paused, twisting the fringe of the blanket in her fingers. "I saw them. Harlan and Duke. They were arguing with Deputy Miller. They had done a robbery, a payroll wagon outside of Silver Creek. Miller knew about it. He wanted a cut bigger than they promised." Caleb stopped grinding the coffee. He watched her, listening intently. "They laughed at him," Lena said, tears pricking her eyes. "Duke, he just drew his gun and shot Miller in the back, just like that, like he was shooting a stray dog." She looked up at Caleb, her eyes wide and haunted. "They saw me. I tried to run, but I made noise. They saw my face, but they did not chase me then. They had to leave before the sheriff came, but they did not leave." Caleb said, "No. They stayed long enough to plant the gun on an old drifter who was sleeping in the stables. A man named Silas. He was drunk. He did not even know what happened." Lena's voice broke. The town hanged Silas 3 days later? They said it was justice. I tried to tell the sheriff. I went to him the next morning. I told him it was Harlan Pike. I told him Silas was innocent. And Caleb asked, his voice low. He laughed at me, Lena said bitterly. He said a woman like me is not a reliable witness. He said I was probably drunk myself, or trying to protect some lover. He told me to go home and shut my mouth before I caused trouble for decent folks. She wiped a tear from her cheek with a furious gesture. So Silas died? And Harlan and Duke? They found out I went to the sheriff. They know I am the only loose end. Caleb remained silent, staring at the coffee beans on the table. His jaw was clenched so tight a muscle jumped in his cheek. He knew exactly how that went. He knew how the law could bend for power and break for the poor. I believe you, he said. Lena looked at him, surprised. The simple words hit her harder than she expected. You do? Yes, Caleb said. I know men like Harlan, and I know towns like that. He stood up and poured water into the coffee pot, setting it on the stove. The metal hissed. I used to work for a man named Josiah King, Caleb said, his back to her again. Down near the border. He was a rich man, owned half the valley, owned the sheriff, too. He paused, watching the steam rise. King had men like Harlan on his payroll, enforcers, if a homesteader refused to sell his land, or if a cowboy asked for fair wages. King would send his men. Caleb turned to face her, leaning against the table. One night, King decided a young Mexican boy had stolen a horse. The boy had not stolen anything. The horse had wandered off, and the boy found it, brought it back, but King wanted to make an example. He told us to string him up. Lena's hand went to her mouth. I refused, Caleb said, his voice flat and hard. I told them it was wrong. I told them the boy was innocent, but I did not stop them. I just rode away. I heard the boy crying for his mother, and I just turned my horse and rode away. The silence in the cabin was heavy, filled with the ghosts of their pasts. I told myself I was leaving because I was better than them, Caleb said, looking down at his hands. But the truth is, I was a coward. I let that boy die because I did not want to die with him. He looked up at Lena, his eyes filled with a raw, bleeding honesty. That is why I stopped for you. Lena, I am not going to ride away again. Not this time. Lena looked at him, seeing the guilt that shadowed his face. She understood it. She carried her own guilt. The guilt of being alive when her father was dead. The guilt of the rancher's wife. The guilt of Silas hanging at the end of a rope while she stayed silent in her cabin. They were two wounded things, circling each other in the dark. The water in the pot began to boil, a cheerful bubbling sound that seemed out of place in the heavy atmosphere. Caleb poured 2 tin cups of coffee, the dark liquid steaming in the cold air. He handed one to her. Their fingers brushed for a fleeting second, sending a jolt through Lena's arm. Thank you, she whispered. They drank in silence, the hot coffee burning their throats and settling warmly in their stomachs. Outside, the wind picked up, howling around the corners of the cabin like a lost soul demanding entry. A branch scraped against the roof, a dry, scratching sound that made Lena jump. Far off in the distance, a wolf howled. It was a lonely, mournful sound, rising and falling in the darkness. Then another answered, and another. The wolves are close, Lena said, shivering. They are just singing to the moon, Caleb said gently. They will not bother us. The fire keeps them away. But the sound reinforced how utterly alone they were. There was no town, no law, no help coming. There was only this small, rotting box of wood and the fragile warmth of the stove holding back the immense, freezing night. As the fire burned down to coals, the cold began to creep back in from the corners of the room. Lena moved her crate closer to the stove, but she could still feel the draft cutting through the floorboards. Her teeth began to chatter again. Caleb watched her. He saw the way she curled into herself, trying to preserve heat. He looked at the single narrow bunk in the corner. It was too small for two, and he would not ask her to share it. That would be crossing a line she was not ready for, and one he was afraid to approach. But he could not let her freeze. "Here," he said, standing up. He dragged his crate next to hers, placing it close to the stove. "Sit here," he said, "and we can share the blanket. It is big enough. If we sit close, the body heat helps." Lena hesitated. Every instinct she had honed over the last 3 years screamed at her to keep her distance. Men were dangerous. Closeness was a trap. But she looked at Caleb. She saw his hands, resting on his knees, open and still. She saw his eyes, which held no predatory gleam, only a quiet concern. "Okay," she said softly. She stood up and adjusted the blanket, opening it wide. Caleb sat down on the crate beside her. She sat back down, and he pulled the edge of the blanket around his own shoulders, so that they were cocooned together under the heavy wool. They sat side by side, their shoulders nearly touching, but not quite. There was a respectful inch of space between them, a border neither dared to cross. But inside the tent of the blanket, the heat began to build. She could feel the warmth of his arm, his side, his leg. It radiated off him, solid and steady. Lena felt a strange, terrifying comfort wash over her. It had been so long since she had been this close to another human being without fear. It had been years since she had felt protected. She found herself fighting a sudden, overwhelming urge to lean her head against his shoulder. She wanted to close the gap. She wanted to press herself against him and let his strength hold her up. She hated herself for it. She hated that she was so starved for kindness that a stranger in a shack felt like salvation. Caleb sat rigid, staring at the stove. He was hyper-aware of her presence. He could smell the scent of her hair, smoke and pine and something faintly floral, like dried lavender. He could feel the slight rise and fall of her breathing. He wanted to put his arm around her. It was a natural instinct, to hold and protect, but he kept his hands clasped firmly in his lap. He would not give her any reason to fear him. He would be the wall she could lean on, but he would not be the one to push. "You should sleep," he said, his voice low and rough. "I will keep the fire going. I am afraid to close my eyes," Lena whispered. "I am afraid they will come through the door. I will hear them." Caleb said, "I am a light sleeper, and the door is barred. You are safe here, Lena, for tonight. You are safe." His words, spoken with such absolute certainty, broke the last of her resistance. Her eyelids felt heavy as lead. The warmth, the coffee, and the exhaustion dragged her down. She nodded slowly. Her head drooped, without meaning to. Her body swayed to the side, and her head came to rest lightly against his shoulder. She stiffened for a second, waiting for him to move or to take advantage. Caleb did not move. He did not pull away, nor did he lean in. He simply stayed solid as a rock, letting her rest. "Go to sleep," he murmured. Lena let out a long, shuddering sigh. She closed her eyes. Within moments, her breathing deepened, smoothing out into the slow rhythm of sleep. Caleb sat awake, staring into the dying flames. He listened to the wind and the wolves. He felt the weight of the woman against his shoulder, a burden he had not asked for but now refused to put down. He thought about the life he had planned. He was going to ride to the Double R, get a job branding calves, sleep in a bunkhouse, and forget the world. It was a simple, lonely plan. Now, that plan was ash. He had a woman with a price on her head sleeping on his shoulder. He had 2 killers tracking him through the snow. He was trapped in a broken-down cabin in the dead of winter. And yet, as he listened to Lena breathe, he felt a strange sense of rightness. For the first time since he had ridden away from the boy on the rope, he felt like he was standing where he was supposed to stand. He shifted slightly, careful not to wake her, and fed another piece of wood into the stove. The fire flared up, casting orange light across her sleeping face. She looked younger in her sleep, the lines of worry smoothed away. "I will watch," he whispered to the silence. Outside, the night was vast and indifferent. The wind scoured the snow from the ridges. 100 yards down the creek, at the edge of the tree line, a match flared in the darkness. Harlan Pike cupped the flame in his bruised hands, lighting a cheroot. The brief glow illuminated his face, The bloodshot eyes, the peeling skin on his nose, the grim, hateful set of his jaw. He tossed the match into the snow, where it hissed and died. He looked at the faint wisp of smoke rising from the hidden chimney of the cabin up the slope. "Found you," he whispered. Beside him, Duke nursed his shattered shoulder, whimpering softly in the cold. "Shut up," Harlan hissed. We wait until they are asleep, and then we burn them out." The wind swallowed his words, carrying them away into the frozen dark, as the two outlaws began to move silently through the trees, circling closer to the cabin where the fire still burned. Dawn arrived not as a burst of light, but as a slow, bruising shift from black to slate gray. The cold in the cabin was a physical weight, pressing down on the chest and settling deep in the marrow. Frost had bloomed across the interior of the logs during the night, delicate ferns of white ice that coated the rough timber and the metal latch of the door. The fire in the stove had died down to a bed of sullen, ash-covered coals, offering no warmth to the room. Caleb was awake before the light fully took the sky. He sat on the edge of the crate where he had kept his vigil, his joints stiff and aching. He watched his breath cloud in the air, a rhythmic puff of white that vanished into the gloom. He looked over at Lena. She was still asleep, curled tight beneath the wool blanket, her head resting on her arm. In the dim blue light, she looked incredibly young, the tension that usually tightened her mouth smoothed away by exhaustion. It felt like a crime to wake her, but the silence of the forest outside was deceptive. He stood up, his boots making a soft thud on the floorboards. He walked over to her and knelt down, reaching out to touch her shoulder. "Lena," he said softly. She woke instantly, gasping and jerking away, her hand flying up as if to ward off a blow. Her eyes were wide and unseeing for a heartbeat before they found his face. She slumped back against the wall, pulling the blanket up to her chin. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice rough with sleep. "I know," Caleb said, keeping his voice low and steady, "but we have to move. The sun is coming up." Lena looked toward the window, where the patch of canvas was glowing with the weak morning light. "Is it safe?" "It is never safe," Caleb said, "but staying here is worse. If they are tracking us, a stationary target is the easiest thing in the world to find. And this cabin, it is a trap. One way in, one way out." He stood up and moved to the stove, stirring the coals to life just enough to warm their hands before they left. "We need water," he said, "and then we ride." They went down to the creek together. The world outside was frozen solid. The snow had developed a hard crust that crunched loudly under their boots, a sound that seemed to echo like a gunshot in the stillness. The creek was a ribbon of white ice, jagged and uneven. Caleb found a heavy rock and smashed it down on the ice near the bank. It took 3 blows to break through. The dark water bubbled up, slushy and biting. He knelt and filled the coffee pot, plunging his hands into the freezing flow. When he pulled them out, they were red and stinging, the pain sharp and immediate. He handed the pot to Lena so he could wash his face. She held the icy metal, her own fingers stiffening in the cold gloves. She watched him scrub the sleep from his eyes with the freezing water, shaking the droplets from his hair. It was a simple, brutal act of morning ritual. "Here," Caleb said, taking the pot back. "Wash your face. It wakes you up better than coffee." Lena hesitated, then dipped her cupped hand into the hole in the ice. The water was a shock to her system, taking her breath away, but it cleared the fog of fear that had settled in her mind during the night. She dried her face with the hem of her petticoat, shivering. They stood there for a moment by the frozen creek, 2 small figures against the vast, indifferent backdrop of the pines and the looming mountains. There was no romance in it, only the hard, undeniable reality of survival. Their hands were numb, their bellies were empty, and the wind was already picking up, cutting through the trees with a mournful whistle. "This is going to be a hard day," Caleb said, looking up at the sky. "I can handle it," Lena said. She looked at him, her chin lifted slightly. "I have handled worse than cold water." Caleb looked at her, seeing the steel in her spine. He nodded. I believe you can. Back at the cabin, they gathered their meager belongings. Caleb kicked snow over the remaining coals in the stove to kill the smoke. He checked the load in his revolver and tightened the cinch on the saddle. We have a choice to make, he said as he led the horse out into the open. Lena stood by the stirrup, waiting. What choice? We can ride for town, Caleb said. It is a long day's ride, maybe a day and a half in this snow. We could try to get to the sheriff. Lena stiffened, her face closing off. No. Caleb watched her. The road is open, he said gently. It is faster. It is a death trap, Lena said, her voice rising. Not just the outlaws, the town, Caleb. You do not understand. If I ride in there with you, a stranger, disheveled, after being gone 2 nights, she looked down at her torn dress, her muddy boots. They will say I ran off with you, she said quietly. They will say I am doing exactly what they always said I did. The sheriff will not listen to a word I say. He will lock you up for kidnapping or worse, and he will send me home with a lecture about morality, while Harlan and Duke laugh in the saloon. I cannot go back there. Not like this. Caleb saw the genuine terror in her eyes. It was not fear of dying. It was fear of the shame that had been slowly killing her for years. He remembered the boy he had failed to save, the way the town had nodded and agreed that justice was done. He knew how gossip and prejudice could harden into a noose. I understand, he said. He did not argue. He did not tell her she was being foolish. He simply accepted her fear as a valid survival instinct. Then we do not go to town, he said, not yet. Where then? Lena asked. There is a line shack about 10 miles west, up over the high ridge, Caleb said, pointing toward the jagged peaks. It belongs to the Bar T outfit. It is rough country, but the shack should be stocked with firewood and maybe some canned goods. We can hole up there, get our strength back, and wait for the weather to turn. Then we figure out how to deal with Harlan. Is it safe? Safer than the road, Caleb said. Harlan is heavy. He will not want to ride his horse over that ridge in deep snow if he does not have to. He offered her his hand. Lena took it. This time, the hesitation was gone. She swung up behind the saddle. Settling herself, Caleb mounted in front of her. Hold on, he said. They turned the horse's head toward the mountains and began the climb. The landscape grew harsher with every mile. The trees thinned out, replaced by scrubby juniper and wind-twisted pines that clung to the rock like desperate hands. The snow here was wind-scoured, revealing patches of pale, dead grass and jagged rocks that stuck up like broken teeth. The wind was relentless. It whipped dust and ice crystals into their faces, stinging their cheeks and making the horse tuck its head. The trail was narrow, a mere suggestion of a path along the edge of steep drop-offs. Lena clung to Caleb's waist. At first, she held on lightly, trying to maintain that respectful distance they had established in the cabin. But as the horse scrambled over loose shale and the wind threatened to tear them from the saddle, she found herself pressing closer. She buried her face in the back of his canvas coat to shield herself from the biting air. She could smell him, the scent of wood smoke, old leather, and the unique, warm musk of a man. Beneath the heavy coat, she could feel the solid wall of his back, the muscles shifting as he guided the horse. It was confusing. Her mind told her to be wary, to remember that men took what they wanted, but her body betrayed her. Her body responded to his strength with a deep, aching relief. It felt good to be held, even if she was the one doing the holding. It felt good to not be the only one fighting the wind. Caleb felt her grip tighten. He felt the press of her small frame against his back, the way her hands locked together over his stomach. Every time the horse stumbled, she squeezed tighter, and every time she did, a jolt went through him that had nothing to do with the cold. He tried to focus on the trail. He tried to focus on the tracks he was looking for, on the horizon where danger might appear, but his awareness was entirely consumed by the woman behind him. He could feel her shivering. He could hear her breathing close to his ear. He wanted to turn around and wrap his coat around her. He wanted to promise her that nothing would ever hurt her again. The intensity of the feeling scared him. He was a drifter. He was a man with a scarred conscience and a pistol. He had no business wanting to protect someone like this. It made him vulnerable. It made him slow. And yet, he slowed the horse slightly, choosing a smoother path through the rocks to make the ride easier for her. By midday, the sun was a pale, heatless disk high in the white sky. They had crossed the spine of the ridge and were descending into a wider valley, a place of rolling hills and dense pockets of brush. Caleb pulled on the reins suddenly, stopping the horse. "What is it?" Lena asked, her voice muffled against his back. "Smoke," Caleb said. He pointed to the north. A thin, gray wisp was rising from a cluster of cottonwoods about a mile away. "Is that the line shack?" Lena asked. "No," Caleb said, his voice tight. "That is too much smoke for a stove. And the color is wrong. It is black." He dismounted, his boots crunching in the snow. "Stay on the horse for a minute," he said. "I want to look through the glass." He pulled a small, brass telescope from his saddlebag and extended it, squinting toward the smoke. He held it steady for a long time. When he lowered it, his face was grim. "We are walking from here," he said. He helped Lena down. He led the horse into a thicket of brush and tied it securely. "We need to be quiet," he said, drawing his gun. "Stay behind me. Step where I step." They moved through the snow, keeping to the cover of the trees. The smell hit them before they saw the source, a pungent, acrid stench of wet, charred wood, burnt hair, and blood. They crested a small rise and looked down. Lena gasped, her hands flying to her mouth to stifle a cry. It was a small homestead, little more than a sod-roofed cabin in a rough barn. Or it had been. Now, it was a smoking ruin. The roof of the cabin had collapsed, the charred beams smoldering in the snow. The chicken coop was smashed to kindling, white feathers scattered across the ground like strange, bloody snow. In the center of the yard, a milk cow lay on its side. It had been shot through the head. The red stain on the white snow was shocking in its brightness. Caleb stood frozen, his eyes scanning the perimeter. There was no movement, no sign of life. He walked down the slope, his gun raised. Lena followed, trembling. The silence of the place was heavy, a suffocating blanket of death. Caleb holstered his gun when he reached the yard. He knelt by a fence post that was still standing, carved into the wood, raw and fresh. It was a simple, crude shape, a circle with a line through it. He knew that mark. He had seen Harlan carve it into a table in a saloon once, laughing about a man who had refused to pay a gambling debt. "This is Harlan," Caleb said, his voice cold as the ice in the creek. Lena looked at the ruin. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would they do this? Who lived here?" "It does not matter who lived here," Caleb said, standing up. "This is a message. He is telling us that he knows we are in these hills. He is telling us that anyone who helps us burns." The cruelty of it struck Caleb like a physical blow. This was not just about silencing a witness anymore. This was about terror. Harlan was scorching the earth to flush them out. Caleb moved toward the smoldering remains of the cabin. He kicked aside a blackened log. "Is there anyone?" Lena could not finish the sentence. Caleb shook his head. "If there was, they are gone now." Then he heard it, a sound so faint it might have been the wind. A scrape, a cough. He spun around. It came from the ground near the ruins of the barn. He ran over to a wooden hatch that lay half buried in the snow, a root-cellar door. It was scorched but intact. He grabbed the iron ring and heaved. The door groaned and lifted, revealing a dark, earthen hole. A face looked up at them from the shadows. It was a boy, no more than 14 years old. His face was gray with shock and soot. He was huddled in the corner among bins of potatoes, clutching his arm. His coat was soaked with blood. "Help!" the boy whispered. Caleb jumped down into the cellar. He knelt by the boy, checking his pulse. "It is all right, son," Caleb said gently. "We are friends. We are going to get you out." He lifted the boy, who cried out in pain. Caleb passed him up to Lena, who grabbed the boy's good arm and pulled with all her strength. They got him out onto the snow. The boy was shaking violently. His eyes darted around, looking at the burned cabin. "Ma? Pa?" he croaked. Caleb looked at the ruins. There was no way anyone had survived that fire if they were inside. He looked at Lena and shook his head slightly. "We need to get him warm," Caleb said, dodging the question. "What happened, son?" The boy's teeth chattered. "Men," he stammered. "2 men, big coats. They rode up this morning." "What did they want?" Lena asked, kneeling beside him and brushing the hair from his forehead. They asked if we had seen a woman," the boy whispered, looking at Lena. "They said, a woman who saw what she should not have." Lena recoiled as if he had slapped her. "My pa, he told them to get off his land," the boy continued, tears cutting tracks through the soot on his face. "The big one. He just laughed. He shot the cow, then he threw a torch on the roof." The boy began to sob. A dry, heaving sound. Ma and Pa ran out. They shot them in the yard." Caleb closed his eyes for a second, a wave of pure, white-hot rage washing over him. "I hid," the boy gasped. "I crawled in the cellar. I heard them laughing. They said, 'Tell her this is her fault.'" Lena stood up. She backed away, her hands clutching her stomach. Her face was as pale as the snow. "It is my fault," she whispered. "No," Caleb said sharply, standing up and turning to her. "They died because of me," Lena said, her voice rising to a hysterical pitch. "Because I ran. Because I am here. That boy is an orphan because of me." She looked at the smoking ruins. "I should have let them kill me in the woods. I should have stayed in town and let them do whatever they wanted. I bring nothing but death. Everyone near me dies. My father, the rancher's wife, Silas. Now this," she turned to Caleb, her eyes wild. "You have to leave me. You have to go, before they kill you too." Caleb grabbed her shoulders. His grip was hard, bordering on painful. He shook her once, firmly. "Stop it," he commanded. He forced her to look at him. His eyes were blazing with an intensity she had never seen. "You did not light that fire. Lena, you did not pull that trigger. Harlan Pike did, but they were looking for me," she cried. "They are killers," Caleb said, his voice rough. "If it was not you, it would be someone else. They chose to do this. Do not you dare take their sin and put it on your own soul. You are surviving. That is not a crime." He pointed at the boy. "That boy needs us. He is hurt and he is freezing. If we leave him, he dies. If we split up, we all die. Is that what you want? You want his parents to have died for nothing?" Lena stared at him, her chest heaving. The logic cut through her panic, but the guilt remained, a heavy, cold stone in her gut. "We are going to take him to the line shack," Caleb said, releasing her. "We are going to patch him up, and then—" He looked back at the mark carved on the fence post. "Then I am going to find Harlan Pike, and I am going to make sure he never strikes a match again." Lena looked at the boy, then at Caleb. She took a deep, trembling breath. She nodded. "Okay," she whispered. They retrieved the horse. Caleb lifted the boy into the saddle. Lena walked beside him, steadying his legs. Caleb led the horse by the bridle. The journey to the line shack was a nightmare of endurance. The wind picked up, screaming down from the peaks. The snow deepened. Every step was a battle. Caleb broke the trail, his head bowed against the gale. Lena walked until her legs felt like wood, but she did not complain. She focused on the boy, talking to him, keeping him awake. They reached the line shack just as the sun was failing. It was smaller than the trapper's cabin, little more than a lean-to built against a rock face. The roof leaked, dripping icy water onto the dirt floor. The walls were thin, rattling in the wind. But it was dry in the corner, and there was a stack of wood. They laid the boy on the single bunk. Caleb built a fire, small and efficient. Lena found a pot and melted snow, tearing strips from her petticoat to bind the boy's arm. It was a flesh wound, a gouge from a bullet that had missed the bone, but he had lost blood, and the cold had settled deep. They worked together in the cramped space, moving around each other with a silent, desperate coordination. Caleb heated a knife blade in the fire to cauterize the wound. Lena held the boy down while he screamed. It was a gruesome, necessary work. By full dark, the boy, his name was Thomas, was asleep, his breathing shallow but steady. Caleb and Lena sat on the floor near the fire, their backs against the rough logs. The shack was too small for distance now. Their legs brushed against each other. Lena stared into the flames. She looked shattered. The events of the day had stripped away every layer of defense she had. "I am so tired, Caleb," she said softly. Caleb looked at her. Her face was streaked with soot and tears. Her hands lay limp in her lap. "I know," he said. "I do not mean sleepy." She said, I am tired of being wicked." She turned to look at him, her eyes dark holes of exhaustion. "For 3 years, I have been the villain in everyone's story. I walk down the street and I see it in their eyes. They think I am dirty. They think I ruin everything I touch. And today, seeing that house burned, seeing that cow dead, it feels like they are right." She hugged her knees to her chest. "I am tired of being alone with it. I am tired of every time a man looks at me. I have to wonder if he wants to hurt me or use me. I am tired of flinching." Caleb listened. His jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. He wanted to tell her she was good. He wanted to tell her she was brave. But words felt cheap in the face of the ashes they had left behind. He reached out and took her hand. It was a bold move, one he hadn't let himself make before. He covered her cold fingers with his warm, calloused palm. "You are not wicked, Lena," he said. "You are just carrying a heavy load on a road that is too steep." He squeezed her hand. "And I am terrified," he admitted. Lena looked at him, surprised. You stood in front of 2 gunmen. You walked into that fire. That is just doing," Caleb said. "That is just surviving. That is easy." He looked down at their joined hands. "I am terrified of this," he whispered. "Of what?" "Of caring," he said, lifting his eyes to hers. The raw honesty in his face stole the breath from her lungs. "I made a rule," Caleb said. "Mind my own business. Do not look back. Keep moving. It keeps you alive, but it keeps you empty." He shifted, turning his body toward her. Now I have you here, and that boy. And I feel this weight in my chest. I am scared to death that if I let myself want you to be safe, if I let myself want you, that I will lose you. Like I lost everything else. Like I lost that Mexican boy." Lena's heart hammered against her ribs. The air between them grew heavy, charged with the smell of smoke and the heat of the fire. "You are not going to lose me," she whispered. Caleb looked at her mouth, then at her eyes. The desire was there, plain and naked. He wanted to pull her into him. He wanted to bury his face in her neck and forget the snow and the gunmen and the dead parents. He wanted to claim this one good thing from the wreckage of the world. And he saw the same want in her. He saw the way she'd leaned toward him, the way her lips parted slightly. But then the boy moaned in his sleep, shifting on the bunk. The sound broke the spell. It reminded them of where they were, of the danger that was waiting just over the ridge, of the responsibility they carried. Caleb slowly pulled his hand away. It cost him more effort than drawing his gun ever had. "We cannot," he said hoarsely. "Not here, not while they are out there." Lena nodded, a single tear slipping down her cheek. She understood. The line between safety and danger was too thin. If they crossed it now, they might never be sharp enough to survive what was coming. "Get some sleep," Caleb said, his voice returning to the rough, pragmatic tone of the cowboy. "I will take the first watch." He stood up and moved to the door, peering out into the swirling white dark. Lena lay down on the dirt floor, wrapping herself in the blanket. But she kept her eyes on his silhouette against the gray light of the storm. They were 2 outcasts, huddled in a shack at the end of the world, held together by fear, by blood, and by a love that was growing in the cracks of their broken lives like a flower in the granite. The storm did not arrive with a warning. It arrived with a verdict. By late afternoon, the sky had descended until it seemed to rest on the very peaks of the lodgepole pines, a heavy, suffocating blanket of leaden gray. Then the wind changed. It shifted from the steady, biting breeze of the morning to a roaring, chaotic force that slammed against the side of the line shack like a physical blow. The snow began not as flakes, but as horizontal sheets of white grit, driven hard enough to scour paint from wood. Inside the shack, the world shrank to the 10 feet between the door and the back wall. The thin logs groaned under the assault, shifting and popping with the drop in temperature. The wind found every gap in the chinking, whistling through in high, mournful notes that sounded like a bow drawn across a broken fiddle string. Smoke from the stove, unable to fight the downdraft in the chimney, puffed back into the room in stinging gray clouds, coating their throats and making their eyes water. Caleb stood by the single window, which he had reinforced with a slab of wood found in the corner. He peered through a crack in the boards. "We are not going anywhere," he said, his voice flat. "Not today. Maybe not tomorrow." Lena sat on the dirt floor near the fire, stirring a pot of melted snow water. She looked up, her face pale in the smoky light. "Is it that bad?" she asked. "It is a whiteout," Caleb replied, turning back to the room. "A man would lose his sense of direction 5 yards from the door. If we tried to move the boy in this, he would be dead in an hour." The reality of their confinement settled over them. The line shack, which had seemed like a haven the night before, now felt like a tomb. The air was growing colder by the minute, the heat of the small stove sucked away by the gale outside. Caleb took inventory of their supplies. It was a grim count. They had a small sack of beans found in a mouse-chewed cupboard, half a tin of coffee, and the remaining jerky from his saddlebags. The wood pile in the corner was low, dry, rot-prone pine that burned hot and fast, leaving little coal. "We ration," Caleb said, crouching beside the woodpile. "We keep the fire small." "Just enough to keep the blood moving. We eat once a day?" Lena nodded, her eyes moving to the boy, Thomas, who lay shivering on the narrow bunk. "And him?" she asked. "He eats what he needs," Caleb said. "He needs the strength to fight the fever." The survival instinct, sharp and simple, took over. The complex fears of the town and the outlaws faded, replaced by the immediate, brutal arithmetic of staying alive. Caleb spent the next hour working with his knife, stuffing strips of old burlap into the cracks between the logs to stop the drafts. Lena gathered the cleanest snow she could reach from the doorway, melting it batch by batch to ensure they had water. Every time Caleb opened the door to fetch a log from the stack outside, the wind shrieked, tearing at his clothes and dumping a drift of snow onto the dirt floor. He would return stomping and breathless, his eyebrows frosted white, bringing the bite of the storm in with him. By nightfall, the wind was a constant, thundering presence, shaking the roof so hard dust drifted down from the rafters. The cold was a living thing, prowling the corners of the room, waiting for the fire to die. Thomas began to moan. Lena moved to the bunk immediately. The boy's face was flushed, his skin hot and dry to the touch. The smoke inhalation from the burning homestead, combined with the shock and the bitter cold, had settled in his chest. He tossed his head, muttering unintelligible words about fire and cows. "Shh, Thomas," Lena soothed, dipping a rag into the cool water and pressing it to his forehead. "You are safe. We are here." She sat on the edge of the bunk, her back curved in exhaustion, tending to him with a focus that excluded everything else. She wiped his face, checked the bandage on his arm, and held the cup of water to his cracked lips, coaxing him to drink drop by drop. Caleb sat by the stove, whittling a piece of kindling, watching her. He saw the way her hands moved, gentle, sure, and tireless. He saw the way she murmured to the boy, a soft, rhythmic cadence that seemed to calm the lad's thrashing. It stirred a memory in Caleb, a sharp pang of something he had not felt in years. It was the memory of a home he had lost, of a mother who had once looked at him that way before the whiskey and the hard times took her. But more than that, he saw the woman herself. The town saw a harlot. The town saw a woman who led men to sin. Caleb looked at her and saw only grace. He saw a woman who, despite being hunted and reviled, Had enough heart left to pour it out for an orphan boy she barely knew. It makes you remember, does it not? Caleb asked quietly, his voice cutting through the sound of the wind. Lena looked up, startled, as if she had forgotten he was there. Her hand paused on Thomas's brow. "What?" she asked. "You have done this before," Caleb said. "You have the touch for it." Lena looked down at the boy, her expression softening into a profound sadness. "My brother," she whispered. "Jamie, he was 6 years old." "What happened?" Caleb asked. He did not pry for the sake of curiosity. He asked because he wanted to know the shape of her pain. "It was the winter after my father died," Lena said, dipping the rag again. "The consumption took him fast, but Jamie got the fever. We had no money for a doctor. The neighbors were distant. They said sickness was a sign of a disorderly house." She squeezed the water from the rag, her knuckles white. "I sat up with him for 4 nights. Just like this, listening to the wind, praying to a God I was not sure was listening." She placed the cloth on Thomas's head. "He died on a Tuesday morning," she said, her voice devoid of tears but heavy with old grief. "I was the one who washed him. I was the one who dressed him. And I was the one who had to dig the hole in the frozen ground because the sexton would not come out in the snow for a family that could not pay." Caleb stopped whittling. The knife rested still in his hand. He looked at her, and he felt a fierce, burning heat in his chest that had nothing to do with the stove. It was anger at the world that had been so cruel to her, and a powerful, overwhelming desire to stand between her and any more sorrow. "You were just a girl," Caleb said roughly. "I was old enough to know that help was not coming," Lena replied. She brushed a strand of hair from Thomas's face. "That is when I learned that you cannot count on pity. Caleb, pity is a luxury for the rich. The rest of us just have to endure. You are not alone this time," Caleb said. The words hung in the air, heavy and absolute. Lena looked at him across the dim room. The firelight cast deep shadows on his face, highlighting the scar on his jaw and the intensity of his gray eyes. She saw the strength in him, the capability of violence that he held in check, and for the first time, she did not find it threatening. She found it anchoring. "I know," she said softly. The night deepened, and the cold became aggressive. The fire was eating through their wood supply too fast. Caleb banked it down, covering the coals with ash to make them last. But the temperature in the shack plummeted immediately. "We have a problem," Caleb said, standing up and brushing the wood chips from his trousers. Lena looked up from the bunk, wrapping her arms around herself. "It is freezing," she said, her teeth chattering slightly. "We cannot burn any more wood until morning if we want to have fuel for boiling water tomorrow," Caleb said. "And that boy needs the bunk. He is sick. He needs the mattress." Lena nodded. "I can sleep on the floor. I have the blanket. The floor is dirt. Lena, it will suck the heat right out of you. You will be hypothermic before dawn." "I will manage," she insisted, though her shivering betrayed her. "No, you will not," Caleb said firmly. He looked at the bunk. It was narrow, barely wide enough for 2 men, let alone 3 people. But Thomas was small, curled up against the wall. "There is room," Caleb said, gesturing to the sliver of space beside the boy. "But only if we share the warmth. 1 blanket, 2 people. It is the only way to keep the frostbite off." Lena stared at the bunk. The implications hung between them, thick and awkward. To lie down with a man, to share a bed. It was the very image of the sin the town accused her of. I do not know," she stammered. "It is survival." "Lena," Caleb said, his voice practical but gentle. "I am not asking for anything else. I am asking you not to freeze to death." He waited, letting her weigh the cold against her fear. The wind howled outside, slamming a fist of snow against the door as if to emphasize his point. Lena looked at the dirt floor, then at the shivering boy, then at Caleb. She saw the exhaustion in his posture, the way he was holding himself up by sheer will. He was cold too. "All right," she whispered. They arranged themselves with the awkward solemnity of a medical procedure. Caleb lay down on the outer edge of the bunk, his back to the room. Lena lay between him and the boy. They kept their clothes on, boots, coats, everything. Caleb pulled the heavy wool blanket over all three of them, tucking the edges in tight. It was cramped. There was no way to avoid contact. Lena lay on her side, facing the boy to check his breathing, which meant her back was pressed against Caleb's chest. For a long time, neither of them moved. The silence in the shack was loud, filled with the roar of the storm and the thudding of their own hearts. Lena lay rigid, her eyes wide open in the dark. She could feel the heat radiating from Caleb. It was a solid, overwhelming warmth. She could feel the slow, steady rise and fall of his breathing against her spine. She could smell the scent of him, wood smoke, tobacco, and the clean, cold smell of snow. It should have been comforting. It should have been safe. But as the minutes ticked by, the warmth began to twist into something else in her mind. The sensation of a man's heavy body pressed against her back, trapping her against the wall, triggered a memory so visceral it made her gasp. Suddenly, she was not in the line shack. She was back in the ranch house, in the library with the heavy velvet curtains. She was pressed against the oak desk, pinned by a weight she could not shift. She could smell the brandy. She could hear the heavy, wet breathing in her ear. She could feel the rough hands ignoring her pleas, the sheer, terrifying powerlessness of being small and female in a world of large, angry men. Her breath began to come in short, sharp hitches. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She started to tremble, a violent, shaking panic that had nothing to do with the cold. "Please," she whispered into the dark, her voice barely a thread. "Please, no, do not." Caleb was awake. He had been lying there, trying to keep his muscles loose, trying to ignore the curve of her waist against his hip and the softness of her hair near his chin. He had been fighting his own battle, the urge to wrap his arm around her, to pull her close and promise her the world. When he felt her start to shake, he thought it was the chill. But then he heard her whisper. He froze. He recognized the tone. It was the sound of a prey animal caught in a trap. He did not ask what was wrong. He did not try to hush her. He realized, with a sickening jolt, that he was the cause. His proximity, his size, his very maleness was the threat. Immediately, Caleb shifted. He scooted backward, moving his body away from hers until he was balancing precariously on the very edge of the wooden frame. He put 3 inches of cold air between them. "Lena," he said, his voice low and calm in the darkness. She did not answer, just kept gasping for air. Her body curled tight. "I am moving away," Caleb said. "I am right here on the edge. I am not touching you." He waited a beat. "You have the say, Lena. You always have the say. If you want me to get up and sit by the stove, you say the word and I am gone. I will sit in the snow if that is what you need." The words cut through the panic like a knife through a curtain. You have the say. No one had ever told her that. The rancher had laughed at her. No, the sheriff had dismissed it. The town had assumed she never said it. Lena lay there, feeling the cold air in the space Caleb had created. He had retreated. He had listened. He had respected her fear more than his own comfort. The trembling began to subside, replaced by a slow, aching release of tension. She turned her head slightly, looking over her shoulder. In the dim glow from the dying embers of the stove, she could see the outline of his back. He was facing away from her, staring at the wall, keeping his promise. "You do not have to go," she whispered, her voice shaky but clear. Caleb did not move back, but his shoulders relaxed. "Are you sure?" "Yes, I remembered." The storm howled, battering the door. The shack felt very small, but for the first time, it did not feel like a cage. It was not an affair, Lena said into the silence. The confession hung there, fragile as glass. Caleb stayed perfectly still, sensing that she was offering him the stone she had been carrying for 3 years. "The town says I seduced him," Lena continued, the words tumbling out now that the dam had broken. "They say I wanted his money. They say I liked the attention. She took a shuddering breath. I went there to deliver books for his wife. She was sick. He found me in the library. He was drunk. I tried to leave. I tried to push him away. He was so heavy, Caleb. He was so heavy and I was so small. Caleb closed his eyes. His hand gripped the edge of the bunk until a splinter dug into his palm. He welcomed the pain. It was better than the murderous rage that was flooding his veins. Afterward, he told me that if I spoke a word, he would ruin my father. He said no one would believe a schoolteacher's daughter over a cattle baron. And then, when his wife found out, she did not blame him. She blamed me. And when she took the rope to the barn rafters, he told everyone it was because of my wickedness. She began to cry, silent, hot tears that soaked into the rough wool of the blanket. He made me a monster to hide that he was a devil. And everyone believed him. Everyone. Caleb turned over. He moved slowly, telegraphing every motion so as not to startle her. He propped himself up on one elbow, looking down at her in the gloom. "I believe you," he said. His voice cracked. It was thick with emotion, rough with a sorrow so deep it felt like it was tearing his throat. "I believe you, Lena, and I am sorry." He reached out, his hand hovering near her face, unsure if he was allowed to touch her. "I am sorry for the world you have had to live in," he said. "I am sorry that men are weak and cruel and scared of the truth. I am sorry I was not there." Lena looked up at him. "I wish you had been," she whispered. "I would have killed him," Caleb said simply. It was not a boast. It was a statement of fact, as cold and hard as the iron of the stove. "I would have killed him for you." He lowered his hand, his fingers brushing the tear tracks on her cheek. His touch was feather-light, calloused skin against soft, wet porcelain. He traced the line of her jaw, his thumb resting near the pulse of her throat. "You are not ruined, Lena," he murmured. "You are the bravest thing I have ever seen. You survived him. You survived the town. You are surviving this. There is no stain on you. The stain is on them." Lena looked at him, and the world seemed to narrow down to the gray of his eyes and the warmth of his hand on her face. The storm outside ceased to exist. The cold ceased to exist. There was only this man, who knew the ugliest truth about her, and looked at her not with pity, not with lust, but with reverence. She turned her body fully toward him. The distance between them vanished. Their faces were inches apart. She could feel his breath on her lips, warm and smelling of coffee. She could feel the heat of his chest radiating through his shirt. Emotion, raw and terrifying, surged between them. It was a pull as strong as gravity. Lena felt a hunger wake up inside her, a desire to be held, to be wanted, to be loved by a man who asked instead of took. She saw Caleb's gaze drop to her lips. She saw his pupils dilate. His hand moved from her cheek to the back of her neck, his fingers tangling in her hair. It was a possessive gesture, but gentle. "Lena." He breathed. She leaned in. Her breath touched his mouth. It would be so easy. It would be so warm. To kiss him would be to erase the memory of the rancher, to replace the violence with this tenderness. But then she froze. The fear was still there, lurking under the desire. The fear that this was too fast. The fear that if she gave in now, out of desperation and cold, she would not know if it was real. The fear that she was still too broken to give herself freely. She pulled back, just an inch. Caleb froze instantly. He felt the hesitation. He saw the shadow cross her eyes. He did not push. He did not close the gap. "I want to," he whispered, his voice rough with need. "God help me, Lena, I want to, but only if you are there. Only if you want me just as bad, and not just because the wind is blowing." Lena looked at him, her heart breaking at his goodness. "I do," she whispered. "I do want you, but I cannot, not yet." "I am not ready. I need to be sure I am whole first." Caleb nodded. He understood. He took a deep breath, shuddering as he let the desire go, locking it away behind the steel doors of his will. "All right," he said. He withdrew his hand from her neck. He pulled the blanket up, tucking it gently around her shoulders, covering her like a precious thing. "Sleep, Lena," he said softly. "I'm here. I'm staying on my side. You are safe." He lay back down on the edge of the bunk, turning his back to her again. Lena watched him. Her body ached with the loss of his touch, but her heart felt full to bursting. He had stopped. He had chosen her safety over his hunger. In that small, cold shack, amidst the howling blizzard, she finally believed him. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in 3 years, she slept without dreaming of running. Outside, the storm raged on, burying the world in white. But a mile down the ridge, in the lee of a rock outcropping, 2 shapes moved in the swirling snow. Harlan Pike and Duke Morris were ghosts in the blizzard, their horses huddled together against the wind. Harlan squinted through the driving grit. He had lost the trail hours ago, but the wind had shifted for a brief moment, clearing a gap in the whiteout. "There," he grunted, pointing a gloved hand, a faint, dark smudge against the gray sky. "Smoke." Duke wiped the ice from his mustache. "Is it them?" "It is a fire," Harlan said, a cruel smile cracking his frozen lips. "And where there is fire, there is heat, and where there is heat, there is our little bird." "We move at first light," Harlan said. They settled into the snow, watching the distant smoke, their eyes cold and patient as the wolves that sang in the dark. The storm broke just before dawn, shattering like a fever that had burned itself out. In its wake, it left a world that was blindingly, painfully bright. The sky was stripped of all cloud cover, revealing a dome of blue so deep and cold it looked like polished steel. The sun rose over the eastern peaks, not as a source of warmth, but as a cold white eye, illuminating a landscape buried under 2 feet of fresh, drifting snow. The air was still. It was a silence so absolute it rang in the ears. The temperature had plummeted, turning the moisture in the air into diamond dust that glittered in the sun shafts. To breathe was to inhale knives. The cold seared the lungs and froze the hairs inside the nose instantly. Caleb stood outside the line shack, his boots crunching through the hard, wind-scoured crust. He squinted against the glare, his breath pluming in thick white clouds before him. He looked back the way they had come. The fresh snow should have hidden them. It should have wiped the world clean, but the wind had been capricious. Along the ridgeline, the drifts had shifted, and in the stillness of the morning, their trail from 2 days ago was gone, buried deep. But the tracks they made now, leaving this shack, would be as clear as ink on parchment. "We cannot stay," Caleb said, turning back to the open door where Lena stood, shivering in his canvas coat. Lena looked at the pristine, terrifying expanse of white. "Why?" "The storm is over. We have shelter. It is a trap now," Caleb said, his voice low. "Look at the air. It is clear for 20 miles. Smoke from this chimney will be seen from the valley floor. And tracks. Anyone following us will read this snow like a primer. Harlan and Duke are not fools. They will be moving as soon as the sun hits the drifts." He looked at the boy, Thomas, who was sitting on the edge of the bunk, pale and shaky but conscious. The fever had broken with the storm, leaving him weak as a new calf. "We have to get to town," Caleb stated. "Town?" Lena asked, the old fear flickering in her eyes. "The circuit judge is due," Caleb said. "He rides the loop from Cheyenne. If he is not there yet, he will be soon. He is a hard man, but he follows the book. He is our best chance. If we stay here, Harlan will burn us out just like he did that homestead." Lena looked at Thomas, then at the vast, indifferent wilderness surrounding them. She nodded. She knew he was right. The line shack was a coffin waiting for a lid. They prepared to move with grim efficiency. There was little to pack. Caleb checked the cinches on the bay horse, warming the bit in his gloved hands before sliding it into the animal's mouth so the freezing metal would not tear the skin. They lifted Thomas into the saddle. He gripped the horn with white-knuckled hands, his injured arm bound tight against his chest. Caleb mounted behind the saddle, sitting on the horse's hindquarters, legs dangling. He reached down and pulled Lena up to sit sideways in front of Thomas, wedging the boy between them for warmth and stability. It was a heavy load for one horse in deep snow, but they had no choice. They moved out, the horse plunging chest deep into the drifts before finding a rhythm. The landscape felt endless, a rolling ocean of white broken only by the stark black skeletons of pine trees and the jagged gray of granite outcrops. High above, a murder of crows circled something dead in a distant ravine, their harsh calls drifting down like mockery. They traveled slowly. The horse labored, its breath heaving in great steamy clouds. Caleb kept them to the tree line where the snow was thinner, his eyes constantly scanning the back trail, the ridges, the shadows. Lena clung to the horse's mane with one hand and gripped Caleb's coat with the other, twisting her body to look forward. She was the fragile thread of warmth in a killing cold. She could feel Thomas shivering against her back, and behind him, the solid, unyielding presence of Caleb. 2 hours into the ride, they came upon a small clearing near a frozen stream. Caleb pulled the horse up sharply. "What is it?" Lena asked. Caleb did not answer. He pointed. It had been a prospector's camp. A canvas tent lay shredded in the snow. The poles snapped like kindling. Supplies were scattered in a wide radius, tins of beans hacked open and spilled, a sack of flour emptied into the mud, a pickaxe broken in half. It was not the work of a bear. It was the work of men who enjoyed destruction. Caleb slid off the horse and walked to a large fir tree at the edge of the camp. The bark had been stripped away at eye level, carved into the raw. Weeping wood were 2 words, jagged and deep. "Don't talk." Caleb stared at the message. It was crude, violent, and specific. It was Harlan Pike's handwriting, carved with a Bowie knife. Lena stared at the letters from the saddle. The malice radiating from the carving made her stomach turn over. This was not just about silencing a witness anymore. This was a war. Harlan was tearing apart anything in his path, homesteads, camps, people, just to send a message to her. To him, she was a contagion, and he was burning the world to root her out. Caleb walked back to the horse, his face set in stone. "He killed this man too?" Lena whispered, looking at the torn tent. "Maybe," Caleb said. "Or maybe he just ran him off. But the message is for us, or for anyone who finds us." They rode on, but the silence between them had changed. It was heavy with the weight of the destruction they were leaving in their wake. Lena felt a darkness creeping into her mind, colder than the wind. She looked at the boy's pale face. She thought of the dead rancher's wife. She thought of the prospector. "Caleb," she said, her voice small against the vastness of the snow. He leaned forward slightly so he could hear her over the crunch of hooves. "Yes, maybe we should stop," she said. "Stop! We cannot stop. No, I mean, stop fighting," Lena said. The words tasted like ash. "Maybe I should just turn myself in. Or maybe I should just let them find me." Caleb stiffened. "Do not talk like that. Look around us," Lena cried, her voice cracking. "People are dying. Caleb, houses are burning. Strangers are losing everything. And for what? For me? Because I saw something? My life is not worth this. It is not worth all this blood. I am just one woman, and I am tired. And I am poison to everyone I touch." Caleb hauled back on the reins. The horse halted, confused, tossing its head. Caleb swung down from the horse's rump and landed in the snow. He walked around to the front of the saddle and grabbed the bridle, stopping the animal completely. He looked up at Lena. His eyes were blazing with a ferocity that startled her. "Get down," he ordered. "What? Get down." "Lena." She hesitated, then slid off the horse, her boots sinking into the drift. She stood there, trembling, feeling small and defeated. Caleb stepped close to her. He took her by the shoulders, his grip hard enough to be felt through the layers of wool and canvas. "You listen to me," he said, his voice rough and shaking with intensity. "You listen to me, and you hear me good. You are not poison." "I am the cause of this," Lena sobbed. "No," Caleb shouted, the sound echoing off the rocks. "Harlan Pike is the cause of this. Evil men are the cause of this. You are the excuse they use to be monsters." Do not you give them that power. Do not you dare give them that. He shook her gently, forcing her to look at him. You say your life is not worth it? Caleb demanded. Who told you that? The town? The man who hurt you? He released one of her shoulders to point back at the boy on the horse. That boy is alive because you tended him. I am standing here because you gave me a reason to stop running. You think you are worth nothing because people have treated you like nothing. But I see you. Lena, I see you standing up when anyone else would have laid down and died. Tears welled in Lena's eyes, freezing on her lashes before they could fall. You are worth every risk, Caleb said, his voice dropping to a fierce whisper. You are worth every bullet. You are worth the blood. Not because of what was done to you, but because of who you are. You are brave, Lena Carter, and I will not let you throw that away because you are scared of the cost. The cost is high because the prize is valuable. Lena stared at him, breath hitched in her chest. No one had ever spoken to her like that. No one had ever claimed her worth with such absolute, violent conviction. It shook the foundation of her despair. Caleb, she whispered. We ride, Caleb said. We ride to town. We find that judge. And we tell the truth. We make the truth matter. He lifted her back onto the horse. As she settled into the saddle, she felt a shift inside her. The guilt was still there, heavy and dark, but beside it a small, hard flame of resolve had been lit. She reached back and took Thomas's hand, squeezing it. We ride, she repeated. They pushed on. The sun passed its zenith and began to slide down the western sky, casting long, blue shadows across the snow. They were approaching a narrow pass between two rocky hills, a place where the wind had scoured the ground down to the frozen earth. Large boulders littered the slopes on either side, providing a choke point that Caleb eyed with suspicion. He drew his revolver, holding it against his thigh. Keep your eyes high, he told Lena. They entered the pass. The only sound was the clatter of hooves on stone. Then, the world exploded. A gunshot cracked from the rocks above, loud and sharp as a thunderclap. A puff of snow erupted inches from the horse's front hoof. The bay horse screamed and reared, twisting violently. Caleb was thrown clear, landing hard on his shoulder in the snow. Lena lost her grip and slid sideways, pulling Thomas with her. They hit the ground in a tangle of limbs and blankets. Get down, Caleb roared, scrambling to his knees. Another shot rang out, singing off a boulder near Lena's head. From the rocks above, a voice laughed, a harsh, jagged sound. Welcome to the party, Cowboy. It was Harlan. Caleb rolled behind a slab of granite, bringing his pistol up. He fired blindly toward the voice, trying to suppress them. Lena, get the boy! Cover, Caleb shouted. Lena was dazed, snow in her mouth and eyes. She saw Thomas lying a few feet away, curled in a ball. She scrambled on her hands and knees, grabbing the back of his coat. Up there, Duke's voice yelled. I see her. A bullet struck the ground between Lena's hands, spraying dirt into her eyes. She gasped, dragging Thomas behind the shelter of a fallen log. The outlaws had the high ground. They were pinned. We are going to finish what we started in town. Girl, Harlan shouted. You should have stayed in your hole. You think you can run with a two-bit cowboy and get away from us? You are nothing. You are trash, and you are going to die like trash. The insults were crude and filthy, designed to terrifying, designed to make them panic. Caleb fired again, carefully this time. He saw a flash of movement in the rocks, a brown coat. He is to the left, Caleb yelled. Keep your head down. Lena. Suddenly, Thomas cried out, a sharp, high yelp of pain. Lena looked down. A ricochet had grazed the boy's leg, tearing through his trousers. Blood blossomed dark and fast on the fabric. He is hit, Lena screamed. Panic flared in her chest, white and hot. She forgot the cover. She forgot the strategy. She only saw the blood. She shifted, trying to pull Thomas deeper into the shadow of the log, exposing herself to the angle of the slope. Lena, stay put, Caleb shouted. Seeing her move, she did not listen. Her instinct to protect the boy drowned out the command. She crawled over Thomas, shielding his body with her own. Caleb saw the barrel of a rifle poke out from behind a boulder 50 yards up the slope. It was aiming directly at Lena. "No!" Caleb screamed. He made a choice. He could not get a clear shot from where he was. He had to move. He had to draw their eyes. Caleb broke cover. He surged out from behind the granite slab, sprinting toward the base of the slope, yelling at the top of his lungs. He fired as he ran, thumbing the hammer of his Colt, sending 3 rapid shots toward the riflemen. "Hey, look at me! Look at me, you cowards!" The distraction worked. The rifle swung toward him. A bullet whipped past his ear, cutting a furrow in the collar of his coat. Caleb slipped on a patch of ice, going down on one knee, but he kept firing. Duke Morris stood up from behind his rock to get a better angle on the falling cowboy. It was a mistake. Caleb leveled his pistol, steadied his breathing for a fraction of a second, and squeezed the trigger. The bullet caught Duke in the chest. The impact lifted the outlaw off his feet. He dropped his rifle, clutching his chest, and stumbled backward. He lost his footing on the slick rock and tumbled, rolling down the steep hillside in a cloud of snow and flailing limbs. He came to rest near the bottom, motionless, a bright streak of red marking his path across the white. "Got him!" Caleb yelled, but he had emptied his cylinder. "Click!" Caleb cursed, his fingers fumbling for cartridges in his belt loops. Above him, Harlan Pike roared in fury. The big man abandoned his cover, sliding down the scree like a landslide. He did not go for Caleb. He went for the log. Lena looked up just as Harlan crashed down into the snow beside her. He was massive, a bear in a buffalo coat, his face twisted into a mask of pure hate. She tried to scramble away, but he was too fast. He grabbed her by the hair, yanking her head back with a force that made her scream. He hauled her to her feet, dragging her up against his chest. "Drop it, cowboy!" Harlan bellowed. Caleb snapped the loading gate shut on his revolver, spinning it toward Harlan. He froze. Harlan had Lena pulled tight against him, using her as a shield. He had a heavy Remington revolver pressed against her temple. The hammer was cocked. "Drop it or I paint the snow with her brains," Harlan screamed. Caleb stood 20 feet away, his chest heaving, his gun extended. His hand was steady, but his heart had stopped. He saw the terror in Lena's eyes. He saw the cold steel against her skin, slowly, agonizingly. Caleb lowered his arm. He opened his hand. His Colt fell into the snow with a soft thud. "Kick it away," Harlan ordered. Caleb kicked the gun. It slid 5 feet to the right. Harlan laughed, a wet, breathless sound. He tightened his grip on Lena's hair, making her whimper. "Look at you," Harlan sneered. "The hero. You think you could save her? You are just like the rest of them. You are weak." He looked down at Lena, his breath smelling of whiskey and rot. "And you," he spat. "You think you are worth saving. I know who you are. I know what you did with that rancher. You liked it, did not you? You are a whore, and everyone in this territory knows it." He looked back at Caleb. "I know you too. Cowboy, Josiah King told me about you, the man with the conscience, the man who ran away. Well, you cannot run now." Harlan shifted the gun slightly, aiming it past Lena's head at Caleb. "I am going to kill you, boy," Harlan said, grinning. "And then I am going to drag her back to town, and I will tell them she begged me to take her. I will make sure she dies with nothing, no name, no honor, just dirt." He was using their deepest shames as weapons. He was stripping them naked before he killed them. Caleb looked at Lena. He locked eyes with her. He did not look at the gun. He looked at her soul. He saw the fear, yes, but he also saw what he had ignited in her earlier that day. He saw the spark. Lena felt Harlan's heart beating against her back. She felt the arrogance in his grip. He thought she was broken. He thought she was the victim the town had made her. She remembered Caleb's words. "You are worth every risk." She was not poison. She was not trash. She was Lena Carter, and she was done being afraid. She saw Caleb's eyes flick to his right, toward his gun in the snow. It was a question. Lena took a breath. She slammed the heel of her boot down onto Harlan's instep with every ounce of strength she possessed. Harlan roared in pain, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second. Lena did not stop. She threw her head backward, slamming her skull into Harlan's nose. There was a sickening crunch of cartilage. Harlan, blinded by pain, stumbled back, his gun firing wildly into the sky. "Get down!" Caleb shouted. Lena threw herself into the snow. Caleb dove. He rolled, his hand snatching his Colt from the drift. He came up on one knee, thumbing the hammer. Harlan, blood pouring from his nose, brought his gun down, trying to find a target through his watering eyes. Caleb did not hesitate. He did not think. He simply became the instrument of justice. He fired. One shot. Clean. Deadly. The bullet struck Harlan Pike square in the chest. The outlaw stiffened. He looked down at the hole in his coat, a look of profound confusion on his face. Then, his knees folded. He collapsed backward into the snow, his arms wide, staring up at the blue sky with eyes that still held the shadow of hatred. Silence slammed back into the pass. It was heavier than before. The echo of the gunshot rolled away into the mountains and died. Down the slope. Duke moaned softly, a low, bubbling sound that faded into nothing. Lena lay in the snow, shaking so violently her teeth rattled. She stared at the dead man. The monster was just meat now. "Lena!" Caleb dropped his gun. He ran to her, slipping and sliding, falling to his knees beside her. He grabbed her, pulling her up from the ground. He checked her frantically, her face, her arms, her head. "Are you hit? Are you hurt?" he gasped, his hands trembling. Lena shook her head, unable to speak. She looked at him, her eyes wide and shocked. Caleb pulled her into his arms. He crushed her against him, burying his face in her neck. He held her with a desperation that bordered on pain, his fingers digging into her coat. "I thought I lost you," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I thought I lost you," Lena sobbed. She let go. All the fear, all the resolve, all the terror of the last 3 days came pouring out. She clung to him, wrapping her arms around his neck, burying her face in the rough canvas of his coat. They held each other in the snow, surrounded by blood and death, under the cold, indifferent sky. It was not a hug of comfort. It was a collision of souls who had survived the fire. Caleb pulled back slightly, framing her face in his hands. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers, stripping away every defense. "Lena." He breathed. He kissed her. It was not gentle. It was fierce. It was desperate. It was the taste of salt and tears and the metallic tang of adrenaline. It was a claim. It was a promise. It was a kiss that said, "I am alive, and you are alive, and I will never let you go." Lena kissed him back with equal force, her hands gripping his hair, pulling him closer. In that moment, the town did not exist. The rumors did not exist. The shame was burned away by the heat of their connection. They were two wounded things that had healed each other in the breaking. They broke apart, breathless, their foreheads resting against each other, their breath mingling in the cold air. Caleb's hands were still on her face. His thumbs brushed away the tears on her cheeks. "You fought," he whispered, awe in his voice. "You fought him, I told you," she whispered back, her voice shaking. "I am not poison." "No," Caleb said. "You are fire." He kissed her forehead, then pulled her close again, holding her as if she were the only anchor in a drifting world. From behind the log, Thomas sat up, clutching his grazed leg. He watched them, his eyes wide. Down the slope, the body of Duke Morris lay still. Harlan Pike stared blindly at the sun. Caleb looked over Lena's shoulder. He saw the boy. He saw the dead men. He saw the long white road leading back to town. He knew it was not over. They still had to face the sheriff. They still had to face the whispers. They still had to testify. But as he held Lena Carter in his arms, feeling the steady beat of her heart against his chest, Caleb knew one thing for certain. They were no longer strangers, and they would not face any of it alone. The return to town was a slow, grinding misery. The thaw had set in with a vengeance, turning the hard-packed road into a quagmire of sucking mud and gray slush. The horses, exhausted and hanging their heads, slogged through the muck. their hooves pulling free with wet, popping sounds that echoed in the heavy air. They made for a grim parade. Caleb rode the lead, his face drawn and gray with fatigue, his canvas coat stiff with dried blood and sweat. Behind him, on the pack horse, Duke Morris was tied like a sack of grain, his wounded shoulder bandaged with rags, his face pale and slick with pain. Lena rode the bay, holding the boy, Thomas, whose eyes were wide and vacant, staring at nothing. As they reached the outskirts of the settlement, the activity on the main street faltered and died. The blacksmith lowered his hammer. A woman shaking a rug on a porch stopped mid-motion. Men standing by the hitching rails of the saloon straightened up, spitting tobacco juice into the mud and narrowing their eyes. They did not see a rescue party. They saw a scandal. The whispers started before the horses even came to a halt. They ran along the boardwalks like fire in dry grass. "Look at her," a matron in a bonnet hissed to her neighbor, making no effort to lower her voice. "Riding in with a strange man, looking like she has been dragged through a hedge backward. And an outlaw," a man muttered, probably her friend. "Birds of a feather." Lena kept her chin high, though her insides were trembling. She could feel the weight of their eyes on her torn dress, on the mud drying on her cheek, on the way she sat so close to the cowboy. She knew what they were thinking. They were rewriting the story in their heads to fit the shape of their prejudice. To them, she was not a victim. She was a spectacle. Caleb reined in the horse in front of the sheriff's office. He swung down into the mud, his boots disappearing to the ankle. He did not look at the crowd. He walked to the horse carrying Duke and cut the lead rope, dragging the moaning outlaw down into the street. "Sheriff!" Caleb bellowed. The door to the office opened, and Sheriff Brady stepped out. He was a thick-set man with a mustache that hid a weak mouth. He looked at the group, then at the crowd gathering, and his face soured. He had hoped this business was finished. He had hoped the hanging of the drifter, Silas, had put an end to the uncomfortable questions about the deputy's death. "What is this?" Brady asked, hooking his thumbs in his gun belt. "This is the man who killed your deputy," Caleb said, his voice carrying clearly over the murmurs of the town. "And back there is the boy whose parents this man burned to death yesterday morning." A ripple of shock went through the crowd. Burned to death? The words hung in the damp air. Brady looked at Duke, then at Lena. His eyes hardened. "We already hanged the man who killed Deputy Miller," Brady said dismissively. "You are bringing trouble where there is none. Stranger, you hanged an innocent man because it was easy," Caleb said, stepping closer. The menace in his posture was palpable. "Duke Morris has a bullet in him and a confession on his lips if you bother to listen. Lock him up." Brady hesitated. He looked at the saloon across the street, where the wealthy cattlemen usually held court. He knew where the power lay in this town, and it was not with the truth. It was with silence. "You have got no authority here," Brady warned. "I have got a circuit judge riding in on the North Road." Caleb lied smoothly, though he knew the judge was due any day, "and I reckon he will be very interested to know why you are refusing to book a confessed cop killer." The threat of the judge struck home. Brady cursed under his breath. He jerked his head at his deputy, a young man who looked terrified. "Get him inside," Brady snapped, "and get the doc for the boy." As they moved toward the jail, Lena slid down from the horse. Her legs nearly gave way, but Caleb was there instantly, his hand steadying her elbow. A woman near the boardwalk sniffed loud enough to be heard, touching him already. No shame at all. Caleb froze. He turned his head slowly, fixing the woman with a glare so cold she took a step back. "This woman," Caleb said, his voice low and dangerous, "just saved a boy's life and helped bring in a murderer. If any of you had half her courage, this town might be worth the dirt it stands on." He turned back to Lena, guiding her inside the jailhouse, leaving the town to simmer in its own confusion. The next 2 days were a blur of tension. The new circuit judge, a man named Thaddeus Blackwood, arrived late the following evening. He was a man carved from oak, tall, severe, with eyes that had seen every variation of human lie. He did not drink, he did not smile, and he did not care who owned the biggest ranch. When he heard the sheriff's stumbling explanation and saw the condition of the prisoners, he ordered a hearing immediately. The courtroom was a drafty hall above the general store. It smelled of stale beer, unwashed bodies, and dry rot. On the morning of the hearing, it was packed to the rafters. Every soul in town had come, driven by a morbid curiosity to see the fallen woman and the gunmen. Lena sat in the front row on a hard wooden bench. Her hands were folded in her lap, gripping each other so tightly her knuckles were white. She had washed her dress and mended the tear as best she could, but she still felt stained. She could feel the stares boring into her back. Caleb sat beside her. He had shaved and beaten the dust from his coat. He did not touch her, but his presence was a solid wall on her right side, shielding her from the worst of the room. Judge Blackwood rapped his gavel, a heavy piece of hickory, against the table. The room quieted, though the undercurrent of muttering remained. "We are here to determine the facts regarding the death of Deputy Miller and the arson at the Humble homestead," Blackwood announced. His voice was dry and scratchy, like old paper. "Bring the first witness." Lena was called first. As she stood and walked to the front of the room, the sound of boots scraping on wood seemed deafening. She took the oath, her voice trembling. "State your name," Blackwood said. "Lena Carter, Miss Carter. Tell this court what you saw on the night of the deputy's death." Lena took a deep breath. She looked out at the crowd. She saw the shopkeeper who refused her credit. She saw the women who crossed the street to avoid her. She saw the faces of judgment. "I was behind the livery stable," she began, her voice gaining a fragile strength. "I saw Harlan Pike and Duke Morris arguing with the deputy. They were arguing about money from a robbery. Duke Morris drew his gun and shot the deputy in the back. A man in the back row shouted, 'She is a liar! She was probably waiting for a client!' Scattered laughter broke out. 'Silence!' Blackwood roared, slamming the gavel down. 'One more outburst and I will clear this court.' He looked at Lena. His expression softened. 'Just a fraction. Go on.' 'Miss Carter,' Lena swallowed. 'They saw me. I ran. Why did you not come forward sooner?' the judge asked. 'Why did you let a man hang?' The question hung in the air, heavy and accusatory. 'I tried,' Lena said, her voice dropping to a whisper. 'I went to the sheriff the next morning. I never heard a word of it.' Sheriff Brady protested from the side. 'You told me to go home,' Lena cried, turning to look at him. 'You told me I was a hysterical woman. You said my word was worth nothing against the peace of the town.' 'And why would he say that?' Blackwood asked, leaning forward. 'Why is your word considered worth nothing in this town? Miss Carter, this was the cliff.' Lena stood on the edge of it. She could step back, keep her secrets, and let the town keep its comfortable lies. Or she could jump. She looked at Caleb. He gave her a nearly imperceptible nod. 'Because of the rumors,' Lena said. Her voice was shaking, but clear. 'Because everyone here believes I'm a woman of loose morals. They believe I seduced a married man.' She paused. The room was deathly silent now. 'But I did not seduce him,' she said, the words tearing out of her throat. 'Mr. Henderson forced me.' A collective gasp went through the room. Henderson was a name of power, a pillar of the community. 'He found me in his library,' Lena continued, tears spilling over her lashes. 'I was delivering books. He was strong. I said no. I fought him, but he did not stop.' She looked directly at the deacon in the second row. 'And when his wife found out, he told her I tempted him. He told her I was wicked. And when she took her own life, he let this town blame me because it was easier than looking at himself. And you all believed him. You all wanted to believe him because he was rich and I was nothing.' The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. Men shifted in their seats, looking at their boots. A few women lowered their heads, their hands covering their mouths. The truth, naked and ugly, stripped away the veneer of their righteousness. They had not been protecting decency. They had been protecting a predator. Caleb was called next. He took the stand with the weary grace of a man who had seen too many courtrooms and too little justice. 'I worked for men like Harlan Pike,' Caleb told the judge. 'I rode with a rancher named King down south. I saw how they operate. They use fear. They use silence. He looked at the crowd. I ran away from that life because I was a coward. Caleb admitted. I watched a boy die because I was afraid to speak up. I carry that shame every day. But this town, you people are doing the same thing. You let a woman carry the weight of your sins because you are too scared to face the truth. You let a man hang because it was convenient. Harlan Pike thrived here because you let him. His words were not an attack. They were a mirror, and the reflection was ugly. Finally, Duke Morris was dragged in. He was gray-faced, smelling of gangrene and fear. He knew Harlan was dead. He knew there was no rescue coming. He looked at the stern face of Judge Blackwood and broke. It was Harlan, Duke blubbered, sweat dripping from his nose. He shot the cow. He burned the house. I just watched. And the deputy, Blackwood asked, his pen hovering over the ledger. We both shot him, Duke admitted, his head hanging low. And the girl is telling the truth. We saw her. We knew she went to the sheriff. We knew no one believed her. But Harlan, he did not want to take the chance. He said she was just a loose woman, that no one would miss her. The gavel came down like a thunderclap. The hearing was over. Judge Blackwood stood up, his black robes billowing. I find that the execution of the man known as Silas was a miscarriage of justice, he intoned. His name will be cleared on the record, though it does him little good now. He looked at Duke. Duke Morris, you are sentenced to hang by the neck until dead for the murder of Deputy Miller and the slaughter of the Homestead family. May God have mercy on your soul, for I have none. The judge looked at Lena. He did not smile, but he nodded. You are dismissed, Miss Carter, and let the record show that this court finds no fault in you. When they walked out of the general store, the sun was setting, casting long, bruised shadows across the mud. The town felt different. The air was not lighter, exactly, but the tension had shifted. The bubble of righteous certainty had burst. People did not glare anymore. They looked away. It was the avoidance of shame, not disgust. As Lena walked toward the boarding house where the judge had arranged a room for her and Thomas, a woman stepped off the boardwalk. It was the baker's wife, a woman who had once slammed a door in Lena's face. She held out a small bundle wrapped in a checkered cloth. Here, the woman said, her voice tight. It is bread, fresh. Lena hesitated, then took it. Thank you. The woman nodded jerkily. I heard you in there, about Henderson. She could not finish the sentence. She just turned and walked away quickly. Later, they found a stack of firewood by the boarding house door. A patched quilt was folded neatly on the porch swing. They were small offerings. They were not apologies. People were too proud for that yet, but they were an admission. The town was shifting. It was a slow, grinding change. But the ice had broken. Lena stood on the edge of the boardwalk, watching the sun dip below the horizon. She felt strangely empty. The fear that had driven her for weeks was gone, but it had left a hollow space behind. She had won. She was safe. Her name was clear. But the dead were still dead. The years of torment were still etched into her mind. Caleb stepped up beside her. He rolled a cigarette, his hands moving with the easy rhythm she had come to know. It is done, he said quietly. Yes, Lena said, it is done. So, Caleb said, striking a match on the post. What now? Lena looked at the vast, darkening prairie. I do not know. I never thought past this morning. Caleb took a drag of the smoke, watching the blue haze drift away. I could ride on, he said. His voice was casual, but his eyes were tight at the corners. There is work up north, or I could head back toward the border, see if things have changed. Lena felt a cold hand grip her heart. The thought of him leaving, of the sound of his spurs fading away, of his coat no longer being there to offer warmth, was more terrifying than the outlaws had ever been. Or, Caleb continued, looking at his boots. There is that land, the burned homestead. The judge says it is unclaimed now, with the family gone and no kin. He said he could sign the deed over to anyone willing to work it and pay the back taxes. He looked at her then. I know how to build a roof. Lena, I know how to run cattle, and I am tired of drifting. Lena turned to him. She saw the question in his eyes, the vulnerability he kept hidden behind the brim of his hat. He was offering her a choice. He was giving her the power to say yes or no. I do not want you to go, she whispered. Caleb tossed the cigarette into the mud. It hissed and died. I'm scared. Caleb, she admitted, her voice trembling. I am scared that I do not know how to be happy. I am scared that if I trust you, if I really trust you, that something will take it away. Caleb stepped closer. The distance between them, which they had maintained with such care for so long, finally vanished. He reached out and cupped her face in his hands. His palms were rough, calloused, and warm. He held her as if she were made of something precious and breakable, like fine china or winter ice. Look at me, he said softly. She looked up into his gray eyes. You faced down Harlan Pike, he said. You faced down a whole town of people who hated you. You walked through fire and snow and came out the other side. You are the bravest woman I know. He brushed his thumb across her cheekbone. You have been brave enough to survive. Lena, be brave enough to choose happiness. It is the only way we win. Lena let out a breath she felt like she had been holding since she was 19 years old. She leaned into his touch. She closed her eyes and let the wall fall down. Okay, she whispered. Caleb lowered his head. This kiss was different. It was not the desperate, adrenaline-fueled collision in the snow. It was slow. It was deliberate. It tasted of tobacco and hope. It was a question asked and answered in the language of breath and skin. He kissed her like he had all the time in the world. He kissed her like he was memorizing the shape of her mouth. When they pulled apart, the sun was gone, and the first stars were piercing the indigo sky. We will rebuild it, Caleb said, his forehead resting against hers. We will build a house that is warm, and we will raise that boy, and we will make sure that no one ever tells a lie about us again. Lena looked out at the dark prairie. It was still wild. It was still harsh. The winter was not over, and the world was not safe. But as she stood there, wrapped in the arms of the cowboy who had heard her cries and come running, she saw a light in the distance. It was not a fire. It was a future. They turned together and walked back into the town, not as outcasts, but as two people who had forged a home out of the wreckage, ready to face whatever the Wild West had left to throw at them. Thank you kindly for riding along with me on this journey. It has been a pleasure to spin this yarn for you, watching Lena and Caleb find their way through the snow and the sorrow to something resembling peace. I hope their story brought a little warmth to your day, wherever you might be. I would love to hear where you are listening from. Drop a comment below and let me know which corner of the world you call home, and if you have a hankering for more tales of dust, gunpowder, and hearts that beat true. Please do subscribe to From Wild West. Share your thoughts in English. Friends, I will be waiting by the fire to read them. Until next time, keep your powder dry and your eyes on the horizon.